It's the night when some franchises find their way to the championship, but it's also the night when some doom their future for the next decade. Draft night is a magical night, a night where chance and probability are part of the game. Teams invest a losing season in getting a draft pick that can become all or nothing. Today, we're going to focus on the worst case scenarios. These are the 20 worst draft picks from the last 20 years, moves that have sent some franchises spiraling into chaos. And let me tell you, each decision seems to top the last in terms of sheer disappointment. But hold on, many of these players aren't necessarily bad. In fact, some have carved out solid NBA careers. The kicker? The stars who were drafted right after them have cast a long shadow, turning those picks into cautionary tales. Unfair? Absolutely. But hey, basketball can be a ruthless game. Let's get into it. There are two reasons why people remember Michael Kidd Gilchrist. First up, we've got his shooting form, a hot topic for debate. But what really stands out? He was selected second overall in the 2012 NBA draft.
The second pick in the 2012 NBA draft, the Charlotte Bobcats select Michael Kidd Gilchrist of the University of Kentucky and Somerdale, New Jersey.
Yes, you heard that right. Second. The then Charlotte Bobcats, owned by Michael Jordan, weren't exactly known for nailing their draft picks. After suffering through the worst regular season in NBA history, Charlotte had a prime chance to turn it around. But instead of landing future stars like Bradley Beal or Damian Lillard, they went with MKG, leaving fans wondering what could have been. In 2018, the Grizzlies also had the second pick, but in this case, we're talking about the second round. So this pick usually isn't very important, right? Well, this year it was. Memphis was on the hunt for a guard, and with their pick, they went with Javon Carter. A solid choice for sure. Carter's no slouch, carving out a respectable NBA career with his defense-first mentality. But right after, with the 33rd pick, the Dallas Mavericks swooped in and snagged Jalen Brunson, a future All-Star and All-NBA talent. Talk about a steal. While Carter holds his own, Memphis fans can't help but wonder what could have been if they'd grabbed Brunson, who's now blossoming into a true star. 2 years later, in 2020, the Warriors had a surprising number 2 pick. The season had gone badly because of injuries, and Bob Myers had the opportunity to add a top prospect to a team that already had everything to win a ring. But they decided to go with James Wiseman. Needless to say, it wasn't the best choice, especially considering that LaMelo Ball was taken 3rd overall. Now, let's be real. On paper, the younger Ball might not have seemed the perfect fit in the Warriors' backcourt at first glance. With the Splash Brothers running the show, squeezing LaMelo into the lineup would have been a head-scratcher. But hey, crazier things have happened in the NBA, right? In 2015, the Sixers were at the beginning of the process. It was the middle of the Sam Hinkie era, and although they had drafted Embiid 12 months earlier, nothing guaranteed that he would become the player he is today. So Philly was willing to use their 3rd pick on another big man. Thing is, they got the wrong big man, because Jahlil Okafor was not only a much worse option than Kristaps Porzingis, but he was also a much worse fit for the Sixers. Now, in 2017, the Pistons didn't just miss out on one star, they missed out on 2. They needed a shooting guard and decided that Luke Kennard was the best option at the 12th pick. However, the shooting guard that was picked later? Yeah, we could say he's having a better career. Donovan Mitchell was picked by the Nuggets and traded to the Jazz right after. And then, just to really twist the knife, Bam Adebayo, a future All-Star and defensive monster, went 14th overall. Calling that a bad night for the Pistons? That's being too kind. No, folks, that was an absolute nightmare. While Detroit was left empty-handed, they watched other teams walk away with future franchise cornerstones. Ouch. Although, what the Bucks did in 2011 was even worse. Owners of the 10th pick, they needed a game-changing shooting guard who could carry the scoring load. So, they went with Jimmer Fredette. Remember that guy? At the time, he seemed like a very good pick. But besides the fact that it didn't work out, the 12th pick was Klay Thompson, one of the best shooters and two-way players in NBA history. It's the Phoenix Suns' turn, who before the explosion they experienced with Devin Booker and Chris Paul were a team that had a hard time winning. That caused them to spend many years at the top of the lottery. In 2017, that didn't help them. They had the 4th pick that year, and even though Jason Tatum had just been selected 3rd by the Celtics, there were still talented players like De'Aaron Fox or Lauri Markkanen on the board. However, Phoenix ended up selecting Josh Jackson at number 4, a player who would only play 291 games in the NBA. If we travel back to 2006, we find another bizarre front office decision. This time it was the Raptors, and this time they didn't quite have the excuse that the player they wanted wasn't on the board, since they owned the 1st overall pick. In their quest for a generational big man, the Raptors rolled the dice on Andrea Bargnani. Now, Bargnani had his moments, sure. He wasn't a complete bust. But here's the kicker. He wasn't even in the same universe as the 2nd pick, LaMarcus Aldridge. Aldridge, a dominant force and one of the best power forwards of his generation, was out there waiting while Toronto missed the boat. Imagine what could have been if they'd gone for the sure thing instead. If we go back to 2018, we find again one of these decisions that hurts twice as much. The Knicks had the 9th pick in a draft that has been one of the best in recent memory, and they decided to use it on Kevin Knox, a player who's never quite adapted to the NBA. Now, at the 11th position, the Hornets ended up picking Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who they traded to the Clippers. And here's where it gets even more incredible. The Sixers used the 10th pick to draft Mikal Bridges, only to trade him away to Phoenix. Can you believe that? A guy who would go on to become one of the league's top two-way players, gone in a flash. But wait, there's a twist. As fate would have it, this summer, Mikal found himself a new home, the New York Knicks. Talk about full circle. Philly fans must be shaking their heads thinking about what could have been. But from here on out, the decisions are getting worse and worse. In 2009, the Grizzlies had nothing less than the 2nd pick in the draft. And after they drafted Mike Conley in 2007, they didn't think they needed another elite guard. So they went with Hasheem Thabeet, the 7'3" center from Tanzania who never found success in the NBA. Now, do you know who the 3rd pick in that draft was? A certain guard named James Harden. However, that wasn't the only time the Grizzlies messed up in the draft in that era. A year earlier, the team's poor performance allowed them to get the 3rd pick in the 2008 draft, and they decided to use it on a hyped-up and promising guard who had been a high school legend. O.J. Mayo became the team's new future star, but his career never lived up to expectations, and the Grizzlies missed the opportunity to draft players like Russell Westbrook or Kevin Love. 3 years earlier, in the 2005 draft, an interesting event took place. Deron Williams and Chris Paul were drafted 3rd and 4th and immediately became the 2 best point guards in the league. It's true that Paul's career has been much longer and more notorious, but Deron was a problem at the time. Now, the Atlanta Hawks, owners of the 2nd pick, decided not to draft either. Instead, they selected Marvin Williams, a player who never became more than a role player in the league. Back to a much more recent era, in 2017, the Sixers owned the 3rd pick, and they only wanted to select one player. Markelle Fultz was set to become the next generational guard. So Brian Colangelo decided to roll the dice and struck a deal with the Celtics. Boston swapped their 3rd pick for Philly's 1st overall, and the Sixers chose Fultz, while the Celtics grabbed, you guessed it, Jason Tatum. And here's where it stings. Fultz's NBA journey fizzled, marred by injuries and setbacks, while Tatum blossomed into a superstar. But that's not all. Philly didn't just miss on the player, they also handed over extra assets to Boston for the privilege. Imagine trading up for a worse player only to watch the guy you passed on become one of the league's elite. Yikes. Now entering the area of unforgivable mistakes, we have to talk about the 2013 draft. The Jazz originally selected Shabazz Muhammad with the 14th pick, a guy who'd been lighting it up since high school and was seen as a potential star. But things didn't pan out for him in the NBA. The real heartache, though, belongs to the Timberwolves, who traded up for him on draft night. And here's the thing. Right after that, with the 15th pick, the Bucks took a chance on a lanky kid from Greece named Giannis Antetokounmpo, a guy who had just played his last pro game in the Greek 2nd Division. Fast forward, and Giannis isn't just a star, he's a 2-time MVP and an NBA champion. Meanwhile, Minnesota's left wondering what could have been. That's a draft day gut punch if I've ever seen one. Yes, these are generational mistakes, and the ones made by the Trailblazers in 2007 is no exception. They had the 1st pick in a draft that looked awfully strong, and there was one player who stood out above the rest. Greg Oden looked like the new Shaquille O'Neal. He looked like the next unstoppable beast to dominate the NBA. but injuries prevented him from doing so. Instead, the Blazers could have drafted Kevin Durant. However, seeing the promise of Odin, I think every GM in the league would have made the same mistake, right? Now, what happened in 2018? There's just no excuse. The Kings had been a dysfunctional franchise for decades, and that year, they had a chance to fix it. However, they decided to use their second pick on a player that would not help them get there. Marvin Bagley became Sacramento's new player, and the Dallas Mavericks had to settle for a Slovenian guard. I don't know if the name Luka Doncic rings a bell, but he, to this day, still has a grudge against the Kings for that decision. Of course, in 2014, everything was much less clear. While there were people who said that Andrew Wiggins was the next LeBron James and Jabari Parker was the next Carmelo Anthony, the best player in the class was another name. Joel Embiid was projected to be drafted first overall just before he injured his foot a few days before the draft. Cleveland and Milwaukee missed out on a generational player for two players who never reached the same status, although Wiggins at least has enjoyed a good NBA career. But it could be worse. The Timberwolves had two chances to draft a generational guard to help them establish themselves among the elite after the departure of Kevin Garnett. And curiously, they had two chances to do so, because in 2009, the T-Wolves owned the 5th and 6th picks in the draft. Of the three available guards, however, they didn't make the right decision. With the 5th pick, Minnesota chose Ricky Rubio. With the 6th pick, they chose Johnny Flynn. Now, let's be clear, Rubio didn't have a bad career, not by a long shot. But with the very next pick, 7th overall, the Warriors took a shot on a skinny kid out of Davidson named Steph Curry. And we all know how that turned out. 2 MVPs, 4 championships, and a revolutionized NBA. The Wolves picked solid in Rubio, but they watched a generational talent slip right through their fingers. Finally, I've got to mention one of the most surreal picks in NBA history. And this wasn't just a blunder by one GM. Oh no. This was a collective miss by the entire league. Every front office, every scout, everyone somehow passed on this guy. It wasn't just a bad call, it was a league-wide mistake that left everyone scratching their heads years later. How does that happen? We all know that in 2014, Nikola Jokic was drafted the second round of the draft, specifically with pick number 41.
With the 41st pick in the 2014 NBA Draft, the Denver Nuggets select Nikola Jokic from Sombor, Serbia. He last played for Mega Vizura in Serbia.
And unfortunately, virtually every team had their chance to draft him before that, but they didn't. Milwaukee drafted Johnny O'Brien. Utah drafted Jarnell Stokes. The Knicks drafted Cleanthony early. The Sixers drafted KJ McDaniels. And all these franchises with second-round picks missed the opportunity to draft what would become at least a 3-time MVP. The truth is that nobody knows if the player they're relying on is the right one. And that, in part, is part of the magic of the NBA. The league where amazing happens.